right, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Bienvenue au webinaire La culture de semences sur Rutabaga. Welcome to Rutabaga Biennial Seed Production. We're going to get started. Nous allons commencer. So for the webinar, all the webinars this year that Bauta has been putting on, we're providing simultaneous translation to allow participants to listen in the language of their choice. You can do this by selecting the language interpretation option in the settings bar to mute the original audio and hear the translation as shown on the screen. And I'll just repeat that in French for folks joining from French-speaking areas. Alors, cette année, nous offrons la traduction simultanée pour permettre aux participants et participantes d'écouter de la langue de leur choix. Vous pouvez ainsi sélectionner l'option de l'interprétation dans les réglages pour entendre la traduction de l'audio tel qu'indique à l'écran ici. And for anyone joining on the Zoom app from their phone or tablet, you just have to click the three dots to the right to find language interpretation. Okay, I'm going to continue in English, and hopefully folks have found the language interpretation options if you need those. So while we are meeting virtually today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands, which we all call home, the land that we live on and work on and plant our seeds into. One of the things that's been really lovely for me about this webinar series so far has been the opportunity to reflect on the diverse origins of seed varieties that many of us interact with all the time, whether we're growing them or eating them, but rarely get to consider that long history of stewardship, most often by Indigenous seed keepers from around the world that have brought those beloved seed varieties into existence. And so as part of this webinar today, we want to recognize the longstanding relationship that Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast have had and continue to have with the land. And as farmers and gardeners and growers and eaters who benefit from the theft of Indigenous land by living and working on Turtle Island, we commit to continuing to learn and take action to address ongoing histories of violence and colonialism and capitalism and racism. And so with this in mind, we just encourage you to reflect on a few questions after this webinar and the rest of your day and into the rest of your week and life. What are our obligations to the Indigenous people who first inhabited and continue to inhabit this land? How can we support existing local struggles of Indigenous people along with the preservation, resurgence, and development? And how do we live and farm as good treaty people? If you don't know much about the history of the land that you're on, we'd encourage you to visit www.who.land or nativeland.ca, and there's a lot of good information at those spots. Okay, so moving into orienting ourselves to the webinar a little bit. So one of the strengths of the seed community and of the feedback that we hear time and time again from these presentations is how incredible it is that presenters at gatherings and events like this, and when we do it in person, are so open and honest with their stories. So with that in mind, I just want to mention that the goal for this event is to create a safer space and to recognize that presenters are often sharing personal experiences, and this requires a lot of vulnerability. So we hope that they will feel valued and respected, and then all participants here with us today will help us in cultivating that environment. We hope that everyone will feel comfortable sharing and asking questions and learning together. If you're someone who tends not to speak a whole lot, then we invite you to move up into a role of speaking more if you're comfortable doing so. And if you're someone who tends to speak a lot, then we invite you to move up into a role of trying to listen a little bit more. And just a reminder to speak from your own experience, or if you want to speak from a collective experience, try to be specific about who you're speaking to or with or about. So that's what we mean by speak from the I and define the we. And then, yeah, please reach out if you have any concerns during the webinar or after the webinar. You can send a message to myself as the host, or you can message Rebecca Ivanoff, who's supporting tech here. Okay, so a few tips for engaging in this webinar before we launch into presentations. So please stay muted when you're not speaking. That just helps with the quality of the sound for the event. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, including if you like the traditional territories from which you're joining the call. You can choose to have your video on and off. Sometimes if you're having tech issues, having the video off is helpful. We also invite you to make your display name your name so we know who you're talking to, and include your pronouns if you wish. If you have a question, you can either put your question in the chat and I will facilitate that after the presentation, or you can raise your hand using the reactions function on Zoom. So just choose the little hand react and I'll know that you have a question and call on you during that period. Okay, so just one more thing before we start. I wanted to highlight a few fun recipes and stories that we got from our partners at Sovereign Seeds in the UK. We reached out to them before this webinar to ask just about a few rutabaga stories, just because they're interested in the place of origin for this apparently a little bit controversial vegetable. And so just to get people in the mood, here's a few that we got. We learned that, especially in Ireland, but in a few places, sometimes people will carve rutabaga as a special Halloween treat, which is a bit fun considering the spooky season we're entering into. We learned that rutabaga or turnip or swede, apparently it goes by many names, is often used as a side for Robbie Burns dinners, traditional side to haggis, very fun. And here's just a few different recipes that folks in the UK shared. So I have a few more of these on a doc that I'll share in the chat at the end, but just to get us in the mood before we launch into our presentations, I thought I'd share a few of these. Okay. So now that we are all oriented, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our two speakers for this afternoon. So Denise O'Reilly will be our first speaker, and she's calling in from Northwest Alberta, where she runs Abunar Seeds. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is a small seed farm focusing on short season, open pollinated and heirloom seeds. So Denise is going to share with us a little bit more about the ins and outs of biennial seed crops, focusing on rutabaga, of course, and the particular challenges of a short growing season. And then after Denise, we have Clint Freund here with us. He's calling in from Wisconsin. He runs Cultivating the Commons, which is a small open pollinated seed operation in Wisconsin, and he'll share a bit with us about his experience in developing and trialing a rutabaga Grex. So thanks so much to Denise and Clint for being here. And I'm going to pass it to Denise, but first I have to switch my slides so that her presentation is up.
Welcome, everybody. I think we still have somebody with their phone not muted. I can hear the news going on in the background, possibly. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And it's my pleasure to be here and talk about rutabaga for seed. I'm just going to be talking about how to do that process. And in our short season, of course, it makes it a little bit more difficult. I'm in Treaty 6, I believe, in Alberta, home to the Indigenous here, and have been active in getting some of the seeds back to the seed keepers in their communities so that they can carry on that tradition. So anybody that knows anybody, or you want to inquire to me later or send me an email about that, I'd be happy to engage in conversation about that. So having said that, as you mentioned, people are going to have their own experiences with growing rutabagas, and I, of course, I'm not the expert of the world on that, so I would consider myself still learning and growing as we go. We've been doing seed saving for about 20 years now, a little bit longer. It started actually when we lived in BC. My husband's from BC, so we lived there for quite a while, and that was my first experience in having things left in the garden go to seed, which was quite revealing and fun as well, which got me started, and I've never stopped. So yeah, rutabaga, we're just northwest of Edmonton. We're in a zone 2B, 3, if we're lucky. Though we were talking earlier about the season extension, and that certainly happened here as well for us. So some things, some years we can get better results with than others. Next slide, if you would, Caitlin, thank you. So rutabagas, that little note that Caitlin had at the beginning there, also called Swedes or winter turnips, sometimes turnips in different parts of the world. They're all in the family Brassica napus with Siberian kale and rapeseed, which is our modern day or our late and older version, ancient version of canola, the original species. So under the subspecies of Napa brassicas groups, they're grown for the roots versus some in the Pabularia group grown for their foliage, such as kale and Hanover salad. So canola belongs to a third group grown for oilseed, animal forage, or bird seed, of course. And that's where we classify the winter turnips as the generally larger ones, though the others can get quite large. Next slide, thanks. So the reason I was talking about those subgroups is because there are different groups of brassicas, and we are able to know if certain things are going to more readily cross with other groups in that same family or not by deciding where they belong in the family group. So if you're going to grow rutabaga for seed, then of course you're going to want to separate and have the distances right. So the rutabagas themselves best grown in climates where your summer temperatures are below 75 degrees Fahrenheit for long periods of time. And luckily in Alberta, we get a lot of that. Although this summer was, of course, the exception, and as different years have different summer values, we were up in the high 30s, 40 degrees for weeks at a time here this summer, which luckily I was growing for seed and not for roots. So it did affect things in terms of drought and that kind of thing. But ordinarily, the cooler crops, all brassicas and all coal crops grow here quite lovely in the summer and don't tend to flush to seed. So there are white fleshed and yellow fleshed varieties of Swedes. So whatever you're growing, it's just a good idea to have that separation. So here's a picture I took from wonderful folks at Broad Fork Farm. These were the varieties, I believe most of them are in the trial that was growing out for different types a couple of years ago that I was involved with Seeds of Diversity and or Seeds, this you guys, the Bauta group. And so it was nice to see all those kinds growing together. I think it was last year I was digging them when they were mostly, everything was frozen solid because we had a really, really wet year and it was difficult to get things out on time. So some of those came out late, but they made it through the winter. So I think we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so what you do if for seed, you're going to want to keep those roots over for a second year in our conditions because it freezes quite solid here in the winter and roots left in the ground won't come the next year because they tend not to store. So if you're in an area where you get maybe -10 as an average, and I'm talking Celsius here, if you get -10 or -15 even, possibly you could keep rutabaga in the ground with good coverage or a little bit of protection such as straw or other things. But if you have to pull those roots up and keep them in cold storage over the winter, the next year they will give you seed. So what we do here is we take out all the rutabagas and we look at them. We do root selection for good size, ones that have been absent of disease, tolerant to the pests, adverse environmental conditions, all those kinds of things. And then we will keep those roots in. What I do is I have an underground storage facility. It's great for potatoes and a lot of different things like that. So I take them out and I put them in a storage tote, just one of those blue totes from, that people store their whatever's in. And then as they go through the winter, we're looking at their storability. We were paying attention to their vigor in the planting season, and those ones we're going to select to plant out for the next year to save seed from. So we should have at least 10 roots for best results and variety, or per variety. They will produce a lot of seed, but you want that diversity. More is better, obviously. depending on the room that you have. So just a note on that. So when these are not what I would keep for seed necessarily. You want to keep the roots on them. These ones have been trimmed, but it gives you a good example of the kind of selection that you're making. They're all fairly uniform. You're looking for the right color. This, not multiple tops. You want a single top as much as you can. And ordinarily I would leave about a 2-inch green top on there. Store with dry potting mix or sawdust in that bin there. And then you're going to monitor for disease and moisture content as you go along. They tend to off gas a lot and they tend to release a lot of moisture. So you have to keep the lid on those cracked slightly, or like I said, if you have the dry potting mix, it helps a lot to just keep them in the right condition over winter. You can do this in the bottom of your fridge, possibly in a bag, a plastic bag that has holes punched in it. You're just going to have to keep an eye on them. Maybe put paper towels in the bag as well. Like I said, they do give off a lot of moisture. And then what I do is I start to replant in about January or February. In those totes, again, I'll make my selection of the roots and I will put them root down in the potting soil. If they've already started making roots a little bit, which they usually do by then, I'll just add a little bit of moisture, not too much, into that dirt so that they start to set roots and tops. We have a little bit of sun in there. They usually survive just well until I can transition them in and out in about April or May in Alberta. We can go to the next one. All right, so generally overwintered roots are replanted in the spring or left in the ground, as I mentioned, indoors in Alberta, because we don't get the mild temperatures that other places do. And in the spring, you'll plant them outside, harvest in stages as the seed develops from midsummer to fall. And turnips are one that will produce seed at all phases of the summer. So you're going to look for the dry seed pods. I actually harvested all the ones I had, so I don't have any. Well, actually, I do have one. Hang on a sec. This is, I don't know if you could see this. This is a picture of a stem and it has a bunch of pods still on it that are in the brown stage. They're quite full. And that's what you're looking for on the plant. You're looking for those seed pods starting to develop. It'll be underneath first, and they tend to develop a whole lot. And so they will produce those underneath first. You want to get them when they're just starting to turn brown or in the brown phase before they start to pop open, because they will actually shell out into the garden. So you want to harvest those, make sure that you're looking for that so that you catch them before they are going to shell out everywhere in that area for you. I think I have a little video at some point. Okay, we can talk about this first though. Isolation is important if you're going to keep varieties pure. So it's recommended that you do 1 mile isolation from other turnip varieties, or you can do the caging method where you prevent cross-pollination within the family by bagging the heads and releasing them every second day so that the bugs can get in there and do the breeding. Oop, and the cat. They're inbreeding plants. The flowers are self-fertile and capable of self-pollination, but they're also capable of cross-pollination with other ones. So once you've harvested your seed, it's fairly dry already. You may want to just dry it a little bit more. Low temperature situation or in the greenhouse. I usually leave mine in there for a bit and stir them up every now and then. And they will stay viable for 5 years in the right conditions.
Did you want the video now?
Is it next, or is the cages are next? Okay, let's just go through the
and seed collection. Okay, let me know whenever you want it.
Okay. Well, maybe we will run it, Caitlin. Then it can see what I did there to put them in the soil, and then we'll go back to this one. You want to handle questions at the end, Rebecca? Or are you answering on the chat?
A little bit of both. I have gathered the questions from the participants. I believe Caitlin will ask them when you're done.
Okay, cool.
I think we've got this up. Let me know if you can hear it.
So I potted up these things yesterday. We've got some golden beets. You can see they're just starting to sprout here. So I've had these in cold storage for the winter, and I just potted them up yesterday. These are turnips. They were laying on their side. Here's some more turnips, different kinds. I've just put them in dirt. More turnips back there. It's a turnip year. And these are the cabbages I wanted to show you, because cabbages sprout from the middle. They break open the head and they start to put up a seed head. These ones I've got in this bucket of dirt. We'll see how they do. There's some more turnips. Turnips and cabbages. And again, you can see that they're starting to sprout from the center there. Can't really see them here, but those are my carrots. And I start them in dirt February, March. And then by the time I harden them off and put them outside, they're ready to sprout up seed. So that wasn't the best video ever, but you could see some of the things that I pot up and how I use those totes to do those selections in the summertime. Cat off screen. All right.
Is the slide back up there?
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so as flower and seed collection, so cage the plants to isolate or plant 1 mile apart. That means the varieties, not the individual plants. You have to remember that when a turnip or a beet or anything like that goes to seed the second year, it takes up quite a bit more room than it did the first year. The tops are quite small, like we all get used to tops on turnips the first year. When the seed head goes up, it can be 2 to 3 feet across. And so you want to kind of give the plants enough space to do their thing the second year, especially if you're going to cage them. You have to consider the space that's going to take. Seed will begin to develop in mid-July to freeze up depending on when you started them. And harvest the drying pods in stages. As I said, they will shell out or self-release, so you want to make sure you get them. Don't harvest them when they're green and full, because they're not ready to harvest yet. They have to be starting to turn brown or fully brown and starting to dry before you harvest them. Because if you harvest them green, the seed's not mature enough, the viability will be down. It's just not good seed to take. So when I harvest the seed pods, I tend to put them in a 5-gallon bucket, the seed pod heads down, so that if they do happen to break out, they're collected in the bottom of the 5-gallon bucket. You can also do it in a dry paper bag, as long as there's no holes in it and you don't end up punching a hole in when you put the seed heads in, because they are quite pokey. And then you just dry them out of the sun in a warm place. Keep an eye on them if you've harvested a lot at a time. You want to make sure that you're turning them or keeping an eye on them, that they're not molding on you, that kind of thing. So here's an example of a cage. It is used when we can't have the distances we want of 1 mile between varieties. Then we do a method called caging. In Alberta, there's a lot of canola, obviously. And so if we're growing turnips and we don't have that mile to the neighbor's field, we need to do caging or some other isolation technique. So it's easy enough to do by making a cage just out of some insect netting. You want to keep the bugs out of there. You can also do this and introduce pollinators. There's less effectiveness than the bees actually doing it themselves, but you can do it with flies and other things like that. But bees are really the ones that pollinate these the most. Carrots, you can get away with flies a lot better than the brassicas, those ones. And so if you have, say, 2 varieties of turnips, you will want to cage one day and open the cage that day for the other variety, and then reverse. Every couple of days, you have to do that back and forth because you want a lot of seed to set, and you need the bees in there at least every other day. And if you can't do that, then possibly only grow one variety of something. That's fine. It's fine. And this is an example of the flowers. So you can see here an entire field of canola. Obviously, we know what that flower looks like. And as it sets seed pods, we can see a seed pod in the lower right here and a bee doing its work. And so each seed pod will set about, well, they set seed on either side of a central runner in the pod, kind of like a double potted pea, but you can have 20 seeds per pod sometimes if you have that kind of variety. So you get a lot of seeds off of one plant for sure. There's another picture of the seed pods. So it has 2 outside husks that come off and a central core, sort of where the seeds collect and mature on. And so when we shell those out, there's a lot of those in the bucket. So we want to collect the seeds as they dry, as I mentioned, 5-gallon buckets or fabric bags, even if they are, fine enough to allow the moisture to escape and not have molding issues and enough air circulation without allowing the seeds to fall through. Or paper bags, I've done that before too. So the seed will dry and it will shatter. You can also just lightly crush them inside the bag and the seeds will be released that way. And then you can dry them further. Or you can take the dry ones out and put in a container where you're storing finally and add more of that seed as the variety is harvested over the season. So after drying the seeds, and usually what I do is dry them in my greenhouse for a couple of weeks. So it's fairly warm in there. If you have a dehydrator that you can monitor the temperature and be below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that is, you can do that as well and dry them in the dehydrator for maybe 3 days to a week, something like that. You'll get them at a nice dry temperature where they will store for a very long time. The best storage method for seeds long term is always to freeze them in Ziploc bags. I find that's the best viability. In turnip, it will decrease its viability after 5 years. So you want to make sure that if you're going to keep them for a long time, and if you're just a home gardener and you're going to save seed for turnip, you're going to have a lot of turnip seeds. So you want to make sure they're viable for a long time. And labeling is always crucial because you cannot tell the difference between the different kinds of brassica seeds once they're off the plant. You won't be able to tell what's a Calabrese broccoli from a turnip from a kohlrabi. It's impossible. So test for germination yearly or every 2 years if you're concerned. Otherwise, you're good to go. And we played the video, so we're good. I guess we'll take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Denise. I think it will work a little bit better if we can do both presentations and then take questions, if folks are okay with that, unless there's anything very urgent that people are wanting to ask Denise. Okay, great. So if that's the case, then I think we will turn it over to Clint. I'm just going to get his slides up here. Okay, can folks see this? Okay, great. Take it away, Clint.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come speak about our beloved baggy roots. Let's see here. I'm going to be talking about trialing, selection, and breeding. Denise handled the seed saving end. I do seed saving as well on every garden species in general that we're all familiar with. I really do like brassicas a lot, but it is a plant we can grow here. Does it live here though? You know, it's a Mediterranean crop. It's very ethnocentric. It can grow here great, but like she said, there's a lot of work that involved in saving that seed because we live in a climate. I particularly am located in Minnesota, north of the Twin Cities, about an hour. We have -30 Celsius up to 30 degrees Celsius in any given season. This year especially, we saw right away in June 2 weeks of different 90s. So that was when I moved here, everyone said, oh, we see 4 90-degree days a year. And so I was like, great, brassicas are going to do great. But it's been a warming climate indeed. So just kind of rolling with that. But we had a great crop. We'll proceed with this slide and I'll just show you what we did this last 2 years. I'm with a business. We started with my partner, Cassandra, Cultivating the Commons. The concept is the Commons is a community held concept. The seed is our commons that we work with. We focus on heirloom, soon to be heirloom, things that open pollinate freely, not hybrids or anything like that. We use certified organic techniques on our farm in the upper Midwest. So we've kind of lived in a few different spots and are actually transitioning to a new spot soon. But we focus on things that do well in our climate. Next slide. I do work with Experimental Farm Network. They are a duo, a collective, Dusty Hins and Nathaniel Kleinman. They focus on, they're a nonprofit that focuses on, when I met them, pairing researchers with growers. And we would practice growing out different things people are working on or breeders. We also grew out all sorts of things from the US seed banks, things like that, to just comb and find interesting, unusual things that haven't, you know, we're not used to or haven't seen and maybe hold potential as crops. So that was my affiliation with them. They proposed growing out a Rutabaga Grex, basically basically a combination of lots of different varieties. So a Grex is just kind of you take a widespread of population of different individuals, let them breed together multiple years in a row, and you develop a very diverse population that has a lot of the traits from all the different varieties you're working with. They've been always wanting to do Rutabaga, and they've been researching a lot. Over half of our varieties were just unnamed ascensions in the USDA seed bank, as well as some varieties they've all come across. They're potent seed savers and inquisitive individuals, always asking people for what they're growing. So they're always curious and have lots of different varieties. Look up them on Facebook or on their website. They have a little store. You can view different things they've grown out and are selling. They also have lots of small scale breeders with their varieties and things like that. They like to move. We'll go to the next slide. Working with Rutabaga and Biennials. They're a biennial crop. Denise did a fantastic job highlighting the Rutabaga and brassicas in general. They make a root the first year. They store the energy in the root and wait till the next season to make their seed. A very evolutionary, nice trick so that they take advantage of the second season with all their stored energy to make a big seed crop. This is a Mediterranean crop. obviously. So we do bring our roots in. We usually store them in coolers in a similar ways to Denise's experience. I'll go to the next slide. Developing agrecs. When Dusty approached me about growing this out about 2 years ago, I quickly just pointed out I'd be willing to participate. But we have to first set goals about why we're doing it, what we're going to do, things like that. I recommended a trial. There's no better way than to see an individual variety when you see it against a tableau of different varieties. So developing a trial is usually a very crucial step, and finding out where you're going. And then you have to find the seed, and then you go through a selection process. Oh, to do the trial, you find your seed, and then there's usually a selection and seed production process. So I'll go to the next slide. We'll just run through these 4 things. Discover breeding goals. So why are we breeding this? What are we working on? Are we going for something that looks a particular way? Are we shooting for a very round root? Do we want long roots? Do we want purple ones? Do we want white, yellow? All sorts of things you could put as objectives. In our case, we wanted to have a wide genetic population that does well in our region, observably well. We also wanted a product at the end, not just necessarily research, but hopefully a seed to which is composed of different traits from all the varieties we're working with. Other questions to ask: what forms are you interested in? Does it grow well in our climate, which is hot, humid in the summer and cold in the winter? Does it store for 7 months? That's one of my favorite. I usually, as a farmer, I've done a lot of CSA work on big and small scale, and roots that store well is a very important trait, and it should store like a farmer stores it. I don't pamper things too much. They generally get harvested on a dry day, put into a bin, and then I check them once a month over 7 months to make sure they're holding up good. And that's usually what I look for. That's important, as well as vigor during the growing season. So we can go to the next slide. Developing a trial too. I always tell people, like, oh, have you trialed some of these varieties, or have you tried varieties in this? Oh, we've tried this, or we tried that. And I like to remind them that trialing is very different from trying something. Trials often involve multiple varieties, usually in a system where you can observe them in several spots over the span of a field, so you can make up for differences in your soil. So often you have 3 repetitions of one variety out of maybe 12 varieties you're growing. In this picture, you can see I had done a bean trial. There's 4 rows, 8 rows total, and we have 2 varieties every 10 feet down the bed. So 4 rows on this side, 4 rows on that side, and they move in blocks. And those blocks get rotated every about 50 feet. We have another rotation of each variety. And then you take stats and observe how they grow during the season. Now that's a very elaborate trial. You can, for our trial with the rutabaga, it was very simple. We started all our rutabagas in trays, transplanted only 10 feet of the healthiest starts. And then at the end of the season, we weighed them, counted them, et cetera, observed them and their different features. So just to iterate, that's an important part of trialing, to capture that comparison, especially when making a larger population or even an individual. It's really good to see. I've heard small companies, for even individual varieties, will get up to 5 to 10 strains of each variety from different companies or individuals. I'll talk about that our next slide. Go ahead, let's go to the next one. Developing a trial. I usually utilize the Organic Seed Alliance's Grower's Guide to Trialing. It's very concise, to the point. It kind of corrected a lot of the errors I was doing. And I think if you can Google that right away and get that, you're going to be set for when your next trialing experience. Other things to develop along the way is how many varieties that you want to involve. There are lots of rutabaga varieties. Actually, looking at Denise's slide, I think we only had 1 of those, and we had 13 others that I've never heard of. So there's a lot out there, and it can end up being a lot of research finding stuff. So make sure to have time to dig around and see what you're looking for. We were obviously trying to get ones from that are more unheard of. Decide what kind of trial method or space you have available. Trials can be pretty small and also hundreds of feet and very elaborate. So decide on how you want to do that. And then evaluation criteria. It's really good to know what you're looking for. Next slide. Here's a better picture of the trial methods. So you can see the different blocks, and then you can see the combinations of different trial varieties. And then often you have a check, a variety that's a standard that you compare to. And then usually your trial is often hemmed in by either hopefully the same species. So if you're in a carrot field, there's beds of carrots next to you, and in between them are your trials that you're observing. So you see them in a very natural growing state. You'd see them in the field. Okay, next slide. And then evaluation criteria, I listed some. Vigor is often a good one. How fast do they jump out? In organic, we like to focus on vigor and getting out of the soil quick, out-competing weeds, etc. Disease resistance was also very important. In our trial, we saw foliar issues pretty quickly. All of them were quite vigorous, but you sometimes see powdery mildew build up on certain varieties, and it was very distinct who was susceptible. So you walk down the bed and you see blocks that were very cloudy and white, and then other ones that were clean and beautiful. And you can also, etc. And then taste and flavor. There's obviously an onion trial here, or shallot trial I had done a year ago, where we tasted each one, fried each, 2 tablespoons and a teaspoon of butter, and tried and flavored, did a taste test. Shape and color. Next slide. Finding your seed, I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's good to really comb and find stuff out there. Organic companies like High Mowing that focus on that is usually where I start. Then I reach out to conventional companies. Nathaniel and Dusty had done lots of work on the USDA. The US government has a seed bank called the GRIN Network. And there's seed banks all over the US with different storage that focus on different families. And they picked out a lot of different rutabagas from that. And the non-governmental seed resources include things like Seed Savers Exchange. Who else? There's lots of different nonprofit seed businesses or for-profit seed businesses out there that you can consult with and find rutabaga varieties. Next slide. We used just a Miss Gladys McGee, one they had found from some neighbor, I believe. The Nadmorska, the Major Dune is out there. Joan is very popular, Purple Top, and then at least 8 other varieties that had no name that just have a bunch of numbers. So threw them in the mix. Next slide. Selection and seed production. Selection involved for us selecting out of our 14 individuals. We selected 8 of the best, varieties, and then 10 of those roots. Out of those varieties, we picked 10 of our favorite, nice, best looking roots. I'm laying next to what I believe is Nadmorska, green. You can see lots of shapes, sizes. They were very large this year. This heavy clay soil definitely, they really basked in that soil. They really enjoyed it. So that's how we kind of went about choosing who we wanted to reproduce the next year. Next slide. Up in the corner, you can see we store our roots in flip tops. You can buy these. They're kind of expensive, but as a vegetable grower, they're very functional. They stack very nicely. You can see behind me, we stack them very high in our cooler. And we often make drill holes in it so they can breathe easily without dehydrating. And then the following year, we replant. Below in this picture, you can see our cabbage. We are transplanting into a hoop house culture. Our rutabagas, I find a little more flexible than the Oleracea species. The Oleracea seems to contract issues a lot easier than the Napus. So I don't mind growing the rutabagas out so much outside, and they did a good job this year. Like some of them got nipped with frost because we planted a little early, but most of them made it through just fine. Next slide. And this is just an example if you want to see more elaborate growth. That same cabbage now is flowering in our hoop house. And then here it is with seed, ripe seed pods. As quite a luxurious stack of pods. And the rutabagas are nearly as productive as them. Next slide. I think that's it for now. I'm going to wrap it up so we can get to the question part. That's usually the more exciting part. I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks so much to both of you. I feel like those were very complimentary presentations and also just packed with excellent information and photos. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions coming up in the chat, and I'm also happy to monitor if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask with your voice in the meeting. You can do that too. Yeah, let's dig into a few questions. So there was one further up here from Lynn around how much of the root do you need to keep? Speaking about rutabaga, and is it okay to wash the roots? Either of you have?
Maybe Clint can do that because you wanted to talk about that anyway.
Today's been a big harvest day. We've had I've been pulling lots of biennials, our carrots and beets out. I was gonna also pull out rutabaga, so I went ahead and grabbed some. This is a classic rutabaga root, purple top. Inside is your growing tip right here. That's the most precious spot you want to preserve in your preservation work you're doing. So especially on root crops, brassica stems and heads like cabbage, depends on what your goals are, but for our root crop here, we want to preserve that growing tip, that meristem. So I often take a very sharp serrated knife and leave that growing tip as intact as you can. In terms of the bottoms, I think knocking off the soil is just the most crucial part. So a couple of bangs on your hand, not too rough with it. Often I feel like the soil also helps maintain a little moisture for them through the winter. And that's pretty much it. I think important note, and I've had issues in the past, if I harvest on a wet day or after a rain, that can present issues when you go to storage. You know, obviously I prefer a nice sunny day where it's been dry for a little bit and roots aren't sopping with moisture before storage. And as long as we're talking about preparation, I was going to mention this is the kale plant, and a very similar preparation. If you're curious, always on the brassica family, maintaining that growing tip in the middle. The only one I do that with an exception with is our cabbages. Cabbage, obviously, we're going for the head, and often I will take the head off so we can observe the interior. This variety is called Dottenfelder, so we usually strip them down. You can preserve the plant like this in storage. I usually put it in cedar duff in a black bulb crate similar to this. So I pack upwards of 20 to 30 plants in a bulb crate with wet cedar chips. With cabbage though, there is an exception. And a lot of brassicas you can, if you did hit your growing tip, the plant will go on. You'll notice every brassica plant, even the rutabaga, does have little tiny growing spots at each of the leaves. So if you had an oh crap moment or you accidentally cut it, it can, go on to reproduction unless you cut all the way down to the stem. So even in your rutabaga, there are little nodes all along here. My mentors used to say, if you take the head off, you'll get less seed, but it'll often be bigger. And so it is a method that is implemented. But to note, if you take the heads off, they do have slight rotting issues if you have a moist or humid climate. So I usually, if I am taking heads off, I will try to do that undercover if possible. I'll pass.
Yeah, I found with cabbages often that you take your chances either way because they are so moist that it's pretty impossible to get them to keep, but you can actually, they almost do better in the fridge, in a crisper in the fridge, because it's a little cooler, I guess, than my storage, less issues with mold and stuff like that. So
Thanks so much, and what a treat to have this live demo here. Thanks very much for bringing those in, Clint. We've got another question here, I think from Solveig. When you plant the roots in totes during the winter, do they get light or root in the dark and then move to light later in the season?
So when I plant those roots in January, February, often they have that growth, as you saw, of just blanched white stems. There's enough light coming in a solar tube in my cold storage that they start to turn the yellowy green. That's enough to give them enough to just kind of maintain them until I transition them out in full shade for like a couple hours when it's not going to freeze during the day, bring them back in, do that for about a week. Give them more sun as they are out there, and then they will flush green. So it doesn't harm them at all to do that process. Like Clint said, sometimes I forget to bring them back in during the nighttime, and they have frosted the tops a little, but as long as it doesn't freeze those growing tips, they will come back again. So it's similar to plants, I guess, that you've had growing in a greenhouse. You're going to transition them, harden them off to get them outside. It's a similar thing. They're just coming from a really low light. Even if you have the plants, say, in your windowsill or something in the house, it's the same thing. The direct sunlight is a lot different than in your house or in your greenhouse, or if they're yellowy at all. You want to just make that transition really slow and gentle, not much time at all, so that they have a chance to adjust.
I would second that. I think this year I had planted out roots straight out of the storage, and I did end up row covering them when we had a 28-degree night or Fahrenheit night come. The row cover is effective, but not as effective as I would like. So that is an important note. If you have the space or capacity, 100 roots can be a difficult task to maneuver or find space for to harden off. But if you have a good week for them to wake up, start growing, I have put like tubs of plants or roots in my greenhouse just in a corner so that they can acclimatize to the sunlight, because they will start going crazy in your storage if the temperatures start rising. Often that's what's nice about having a cooler from a veggie business. You have a cooling unit usually if your spring's hot but not ready to plant out, just because you're not past the late frost. You can keep them at 34 degrees until you're ready to pull them out to start getting them ready. That'd be my advice. Just be careful. Keep an eye on them in April, March and April. They might run away from you sometimes.
Nice, thanks.
And the other thing I want to mention, just about having them in the dirt like that, by the time I plant them out, and even if the tops are like, already bushy like this per plant and the roots are the same, it doesn't seem to affect them too much. They're not that root sensitive that you can just pull them apart out of the tub, plug them in the ground, cover them up, water them in, they just go. They might set back a little bit, but they don't mind the roots being too close together if you have lack of space and you're doing the tub thing like I was doing.
So maybe a related question before we get off of tubs and storage. Someone asked, how do you keep the carrots or roots that you're keeping in these tubs from rotting?
Okay. My flip tops, generally, like when they go into them, I fill them with maybe a few inches at the top of the flip top so that air can be there. I try to make sure there isn't too much soil. Soil can trap moisture in between the roots, and then the moisture can cause rot. So making sure you've maybe roughed off the soil, but you do not need to wash them. I think washing encourages moisture, and I try to minimize that. And then what else? Keeping it as low as under 35, as you can, is the best bet. If you can, the closer you can get to freezing without freezing the tissue, that is the longer they will store. So whatever you're capable of, the better. In our case, we usually put a heater in our walk-in cooler in the winter, and that keeps it above freezing. And then during the spring, if we are having a warm snap, you can often use a cool bot or a cooling unit to keep them from escaping. A lot of hoops to jump through.
Yeah, and I would say that similar for the carrots. If you wash them, you're going to just introduce way more problems than leaving them unwashed. Get as much dirt off as you can. And also when I bring the roots in, maybe Clint does this too, is I'll leave them out in the sun for a day, kind of just to completely dry outside on the dirt, get them nice and dry. And then if you're just going to do a few for next year, you can get those veggie bags, the Ziploc veggie bags with the tiny micro holes in them. And if you want to store like 10 or 15 or 20 carrots in there, again, leave the tops. That's the part you got to watch for rot, because that part is vegetative and it will rot first if anything rots at all. But put them in there and then put them in the bottom of your crisper or fridge that you don't use or any of that kind of thing. Keep an eye on them. Turn them over. If they're too moist, just open the Ziploc and let all that come out. Get them dry again. They could be really wilty by the time spring comes, but they will be starting to grow root hairs, and they can go into dirt at that point when you start to see that they're growing, and just let them do their thing again. You can have them quite close together in that sawdust or whatever. And by the time you plant them out, they might be all strung together. But I just dig a big trench, lay them in there, kind of separate them as they would be, and they'll just grow from there.
We've got kind of a fun question from Jennifer here around greens. I'll just read it out. Rutabaga greens are way better than turnip greens, but I don't know of any rutabaga selections for greens, unlike turnips. So something I'd like to pursue in the future is a variety best for greens. Does anyone know of one already? Any insights into rutabaga greens?
I don't. Clint, what do you think?
I mean, people love red Russian kale, and often find it, and so do flea beetles. But yeah, I think it's one of the more delicious greens out there for sure. Soft, velvety. I think often people prefer them to the Oleracea kales when they can get them. But I don't know. I didn't. That wasn't a trial criteria in our trial this year, and we didn't go about taste testing. Although that would be very interesting. I did notice there is a plethora of leaf types, deep serrations, broadleaves, you name it. Like even in our 14 things, I saw things that completely block the sunlight and things that were not blocking sunlight at all, yet growing good roots. And so there's a stunning diversity of greens out there that could be a part of your process.
And if you haven't tried collard greens at all, I would think they'd be the closest thing to a turnip type flavor. There's quite a few of those out there now. So, but as far as growing them for the tops to eat, I haven't done that myself. I just strip a few leaves early spring because they're all kind of nice and sweet and tender. And you can do that if you're growing them for roots without too much trouble. But if you just want only tops and never get a root, then you can keep cutting them back, but that will only last so long, I guess.
Okay. Let's see, we have a question here around number of units for selection. So Audrey asked why only use 10 units for selection and not take a wider spectrum? And then maybe related to that, it's just how many roots you should bring into storage and how many you should plant in order to get a good genetic mix for the next generation.
We started off our selection. I mean, often outcrossers, you want to shoot for a 200 minimum of individuals, you know, and then maybe double that, what you take into storage, depending on how familiar you are with each one, just so you can have some casualties along the way, or selection. Look, Brad, they make a lot of seed, no doubt about it. Our goal was a saleable crop, and we definitely selling pounds of rutabaga seed. They, as a company, they might sell ounces in a year, depending on the marketing or what have you. So, yeah, I think 10 roots of 8 different varieties seemed like 80 population. That seemed like a strong representation of the groups that we liked, or the individuals, and then taking the best individuals in each variety hopefully captures that. It was not the most meticulous process, but something that was hashed out in the field. But I think, you know, if you can afford more, I would go for it. You know, they don't, like she said, you can, if you have the real estate in your garden or farm to throw more individuals in, that's great. And you can sprout any extra seed you have for your salads. But yeah, that was kind of where we were at and what we thought we needed. We only grew about 10 to 15 feet of each variety, so we were kind of limited in that capacity too.
And I think if you're a small gardener, from the reading that I did and from my own experience, there are certain things that you absolutely need to guarantee that you have a lot of in order to get the genetic diversity carrying forward. And turnips are not one of those things. So if you've got 10 and you're crossing those, that's probably the minimum. You know, 40, 50 would be great. But again, you're going to have pounds and pounds of turnip seed. So if you're a single grower, you know, in a back garden setting, you probably, you know, wouldn't see too much lack of genetic diversity with 3 or 4 plants over time. But again, 10 is the minimum you kind of want to aim for. But again, it depends on the amount of space that you have. So as I was mentioning, if I'm doing 4 or 5 different kinds a year and I'm trying to keep them pure, that's all I can manage is 10 roots of those varieties in the space that I have, because my gardens are quite far apart. And I can manage 2 kinds in each garden kind of throughout the season. But that's why I do that amount. Maybe Bob has something to say about that.
Does Bob have something to say about that?
I'm thank you, but no, that's awesome.
I was gonna say that Bob's book, Seeds of Diversity's book, says for community use a minimum would be 12, and for commercial use their suggestion is 80. So very similar to what you said, Denise.
Great, thanks, folks. Any live questions from the audience here? Coming to the end of the ones in the chat, I think. There is one question posed by folks who there was an option to include a question in the registration form. So I wonder if anyone has reflections on just how Rutabaga compares to other biennials in terms of difficulty, or things to start out with, or things to keep in mind. Any general reflections on comparing biennials?
I think they're personally a beautiful root and they taste great. We like to make fries with them or mash them with potatoes. So as a crop to grow and eat, I'm often looking, as a seed crop, I'm usually looking for twofers. So whenever I'm growing a crop, I hopefully get something out of it for eating or feeding friends and family. So rutabagas are great. They store very easily. I mean, even in this spring, we forgot to clean out the fridge after we had planted everything, and those bags of roots just kept going, and they really didn't they didn't go bad for quite a number of months there. So as a storage crop, they're fantastic. And yeah, how do they compare to other roots? Yeah, they're definitely less fickle, but they take up real estate and in your garden. They can get quite large, and then I think they need a full season. So if you're into that, this is a good one.
Yep, I would agree with all that. And I think if you're going to try brassicas, turnips are the easiest ones to start with because they will yield you a result, and you can trial and error from there on the other ones. Definitely one of the easier ones to get seed off of. And somebody was saying that they can't stand turnip, and how could they eat it? Well, during the war, they used to use turnips to make strawberry jam, and they would just crush them and add strawberry flavoring, and everybody was eating that and never, well, probably knew the difference, but it was all that they had. So there you go. Maybe that's how you want to eat your turnips from now on.
Gonna have to try that. That's so neat. Okay. I'm just going through my list of other questions from the forum here. Do either of you have any thoughts on dehybridizing rutabaga seed? I know both of you are open pollinated folks. I wonder if any of you have experimented with that.
Not enough here. In fact, I don't know many rutabaga hybrids out there. Usually they're open pollinated often. They may or may not be worth the work of a company going through the process of making infertile lines, but the dehybridizing process can be a multi-generational thing usually. In my small experience, usually the second generation looks similar, and then the third generation usually experiences a more explosion of different stuff. And then you kind of rein it in over the next coming years, the diversity, and try to hone in on what you're looking for. But that's my small experience with bok choys.
Yeah, I would say that's true of rutabagas. I don't know too many that are what they would call hybrid. I think it falls into that class where it's very rare that they will say hybrid turnip or not, rutabaga. It's usually open pollinated, and those are the best ones in my opinion. If it's they're just selecting roots and saying it's from Laurentian, for instance, and calling it American purple top, which they probably did over time. You basically have a very similar root, and it's just selected for different traits. So yeah, it's probably an easy process, I would say, and like fun. It's not going to be as, like Clint says, you're going to not probably get as much diversity and selection as you get from, say, a squash or something like that, or corn. But yeah, it'd be fun to do. I haven't done it myself.
I will say, looking for something to play with, biennials do require that hurdle of work, so of storage. So I would, maybe if you want to play with a hybrid, pick a more annual based plant, and that could ensure some success. Like I'm thinking maybe like a radish, spring radish. You can sow that, eat it, select it, and then replant them to make seed during the midsummer. I did have some of my rutabaga seed fall into my garlic, and it was able to make roots amongst the chaff. So I was kind of surprised. Usually it's a 3-year process, right? Grow the root, grow the seed. Then the 3rd year, you can finally grow out your seed to see what you've done. And then you repeat the process. So 2 generations takes 5 years or so. So it can be a long haul if you're interested, unless university folks can often cheat that by doing indoor grow outs to speed up the process. So if you have a friend with a greenhouse that they're not playing with in the winter, that is something you could pursue.
Okay, we had one more question come up in the chat here. Has anyone grown ancient giant cabbage turnips? It was sold through Baker Creek Seeds a few years ago and listed as an Oleracea. They looked like a diverse rutabaga cross to me. Curious if anyone has info about that variety, about ancient giant cabbage turnips. Getting some head nods.
No, I haven't heard of that one even. So that's kind of interesting.
You know what I do know is that the Oleracea and Napus are very closely related, right? I think we've estimated they were a hypothetical, a chance cross of Rapa and Oleracea. So that I'd be curious to see what that variety. That's the Oleracea you said. So that sounds really interesting to grow out. There's not a lot of root Oleraceae, I guess.
So we've got another question, perhaps a question for Clint, but feel free to jump in, Denise, if you like. How do you incorporate seed crops into the long task list on the farm? I think this is especially relevant for folks who are integrating seed work into market gardens. It can be hard to make time for that. If either of you have reflections on that.
I did about 10 years at a large scale 50-acre farm. It was organic, and then I had a small cooperative garden with friends where I dabbled in seed work. And so often it's definitely been a pastime, and only in my 12 years of farming, the last 5 years, I've been able to dedicate a good amount of time. But usually 40 hours a week, I'm at a different farm working, and then I do an acre on my own at home. And I try to play and experiment, but know my time is valuable, especially with family. You can only do so many things, and farmers are extreme optimists usually. So you do have to be careful. I did spend time with the CSA, a small scale CSA, and it worked out really well. I think growing out seed and seed sovereignty and developing seed that works in your area or place, I think is a really worthwhile thing to pursue, especially as a farmer. On our CSA, we could take my seed crops, sow them out, and do intensive selections or hone in on it. Usually farmers are great at grilling stuff and putting it through the trenches. So if you have the opportunity to engage it on your farm, even in small ways, I think it's a very worthwhile thing. I've just had a lot of luxury and to experiment on my own while also working for or with vegetable outfits. So it usually gets hemmed in one way. If you can find a mentor in your area or your region that would work with you, I'm definitely into that, and I've mentored lots of folks on 1 or 2 crops that they want to play with. So it's usually when there's someone around, it makes that load a lot easier. Especially in the biennial realm, I've shoveled biennials on people a lot. Like, I'm not going to grow this year, someone help me. And then usually someone grows something for me for fun. So yeah, hope that answers your question. It is a lot to juggle, and I think on my outfit, I almost just focus on seed work when I get home. So there is a little bit of a market hustle, but usually the market hustle and CSA model can be distracting from the seed work, and you have to be out there regularly watching the crops, making sure you don't miss those crucial windows. You have to learn a crop and those crucial windows not to miss. Everything from especially the harvest windows. And so it's something you live and learn and develop and then expand slowly year by year. Definitely don't try to do 10 different species at once or whatever, etc.
Yeah, and I did, my daughter did run a CSA here, and I've done a market garden the last couple of years with the seed production, but in my experience, one is always going to suffer. So it seems that people that do it, they either do one or they do the other, and they don't have time for both unless it's forgot to pick that row of peas or whatever. But if you're working a CSA, usually everything you're producing is going to customers and you don't have anything left for seed. So it's something you can do on a small scale for yourself, just in your garden, leaving 1 or 2 plants, because then you're picking everything, but you're also getting the seed, but you don't have a ton of seed to produce at the end of the year either, to harvest and dry and all that kind of stuff. So Yeah, I'm still optimistic, like Clint says, and thinking I can do everything, but always something will suffer. So that's usually how that goes.
I will say there is a lot of power in that situation with the farmer. I think they're again trying to really hone in, be efficient, be lean, etc. And the farm I worked at, the first night I met them in my interview, we went in their fridge and found a whole bunch of onions. And I'm like, "What are these onions?" And they're like, "Well, we can't sell them, and we're kind of done for the year." And I'm and they had boxes of them, like 4 boxes. So I immediately said, "We're sorting these now. I think you have a nice seed project on your hands. You guys sorted out all the early bolters. We now have roots that are storing really well in a farmer setting, and we're going to pick 100 of our favorite." And immediately there, you have a farm variety that's probably hands down better than what they bought at the store. I think they said 10% were bolting. This is high mowing seed, I believe, from the yellow Cipollini. And the crisis was already underway with COVID, and all these people were sold out of it. So it was very interesting and fortuitous opportunity to play with that concept. I mean, these farmers do have stuff, and they can take your varieties. And I've always dreamed about growing out different things at larger farms, and then gathering my 100 roots, from their 10,000, and working with them on that. You maybe focus on the seed, they focus on the farming, and you can develop a good synergy. I've seen a lot of seed companies do that.
That's awesome. Okay. I'm going to say there's a little bonus question in the chat for anyone who's interested, where we're crowdsourcing fun Rutabaga recipes to use with our audacious harvests, especially for those who've been involved with the CANOVI trials. So if you have a fun Rutabaga recipe, feel free to throw it in the chat and we'll share those with folks afterwards. Maybe aside from that, maybe we have time for one more question. There's a question in here around cleaning Rutabaga seed. So if you have any special techniques for cleaning the seed that you could share, how best to thresh, do you use a fan for winnowing, or what kind of techniques do you folks use?
Sure. Yeah, I find it one of the easiest ones to clean too. So versus beets or even carrots. So what I do, as I mentioned, it's in the 5-gallon bucket, and the seeds are nice and round, and the chaff is always floating on the top. So I kind of swirl it around and get most of those big seed pod parts off. And then I will just winnow it in the wind. I do have a little sieve that has the right sized holes. I use that as well, but since some of the little parts fall through, but you can get it super clean just by doing that. And if any lighter seed blows over, that's fine too. You can use a fan for that if you have an indoor setting, and then your fan is always a constant speed, and it's not the wind. It just all of a sudden decides to whoosh, and then half your seeds are over top of the bucket. So, but pick any of those methods, works really good. And the nice little round seeds usually fall through the sieves, and the rest stays on the top. You can get them pretty clean in a hurry.
I would second most of that. Usually in the field, I usually harvest onto tarps, let them cure on tarps under either in the sun or out of the rain. And then they usually get danced on. I usually pull the stems off. I often have screens I built either out of cedar or pine, depending on if they're wet or dry seeds. You can find window screen. I think 1/8 inch works really well, that you can get at stores. 1/4 and 1/8 inch are great for brassicas. This, and also when you're making your screens, make sure they fit your technology. Like this fits on my tubs and sits right on top of the tub, so you can just hold your tub while you're sifting and winnowing. And then I think the second, winnowing is great. If you have a winnow wizard in the area, you can probably find someone. It's a new tool that's very, very efficient at cleaning seed using the winnow wizard. Also, if you're at home, I make these. These are 3-sided boards. And often you can get 2. And the concept is here, seeds are round in the Brassicaceae family. rocks, dented seed, sprouted seed, unusual seed, maybe you don't want to resale or put through your seeder, you can often put the seed in this tray and then dump into this one. So you have the seed, shake, 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 and roll the seed out into that tray. And this, you can clean a pound of seed in 5 minutes, and you will have very high quality seed that is rolled out into your lower tray. And that works with a few different varieties or species of plants, but the trays are great for blowing and rolling seed if you need to, and very cheap.
Immensely helpful. Thanks so much, folks. Okay, I think that we are coming up to the end of our time. So I'm just going to share a few closing slides that I have. Okay, hopefully folks can see that. Okay, I just want to thank Denise and Clint for all of their wonderful insights and for sharing your time with us today. I think that was so valuable, and I think you both did an awesome job of demystifying this sometimes intimidating seed saving crop, and hopefully have inspired a lot of folks in here to jump in on the Rutabaga saving train. So thank you so much to both of you. Yeah, so for just wrapping up here, we really value your feedback. I think Rebecca is maybe going to share a poll that we have just to gather a few kind of initial thoughts on how much your level of knowledge about Rutabaga seed saving has changed over the course of this webinar and just the overall quality of it. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. We'll leave it up for a minute. But also if you have any other feedback on this webinar or ideas for future webinars, please feel free to send those to me. My email is on the screen, or you can find the emails for all of the regional coordinators for the Bauta Initiative on our website, which I think is on the next slide. Yeah, seedsecurity.ca. The next webinar in our series, it is imminently going to have a date announced, but for sure going to be next month. We're going to be looking at how to breed your own potato variety. We also have a webinar coming up on red carrots. So please go check out our website, seedsecurity.ca, and stay up to date on all of the webinars that are coming up for more awesome insights like we got today from Denise and Clint. So I think that's it for us. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. You'll get this webinar recording and some other resources from me in the coming days. And thanks once again to Denise and Clint for all your expertise. Bye, everyone.